Growing up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, I often felt like I was living someone else's life from the sidelines, watching everything unfold while somehow never really being part of it. My older brother Ryan was the center of our family's universe from the moment I can remember anything clearly. Everything about him seemed to shine brighter in our parents' eyes, like he was destined for something extraordinary while I was simply there to fill the empty space in the background. When we were kids, the difference in how we were treated was subtle at first, but even then it was impossible not to notice. Ryan could do something wrong, and somehow it would turn into a small misunderstanding or a funny story at dinner. If I did the same thing, it became a lecture about responsibility, discipline, and how I needed to do better. One of the earliest memories that stuck with me happened when we were both still in elementary school. Ryan forgot to do a homework assignment, and my mom immediately picked up the phone and called the teacher, explaining that Ryan had been overwhelmed with activities and that it must have slipped his mind. The teacher accepted the explanation, and Ryan never faced any consequences. A few months later, I forgot a homework assignment of my own, and instead of a phone call to the teacher, I was grounded for an entire week. No TV, no video games, and a long speech about how careless I was becoming. Mom and Dad never said Ryan was the favorite, but they didn't have to. It showed in every little decision they made. Ryan's birthday parties were huge events that the entire neighborhood seemed to know about. Our backyard would be filled with decorations, rented inflatables towering over the fence, music playing loudly while dozens of kids ran around with cake and soda. My parents would smile proudly as Ryan opened piles of presents, laughing with the other parents about how popular he was becoming. When my birthday came around, the energy in the house felt completely different. Most years it was just pizza on the kitchen table and a quiet evening at home. Sometimes a couple of my friends would come over, but there was never anything elaborate. My parents would smile politely and say something like, maybe next year we will do something bigger. Eventually, I stopped expecting that next year to ever come. As we got older, the differences only became more obvious. Ryan was always encouraged to try new things. If he wanted to join a sports team, my parents paid for the equipment without hesitation. If he wanted to quit halfway through the season because he got bored, they told him it was okay and that he should focus on whatever made him happiest. When I asked to join activities, the conversation immediately turned into questions about cost, commitment, and whether it would distract me from school. Most of the time, the answer ended up being no, or maybe later. By the time we reached middle school, I had started to accept a strange role within the family. Ryan was the star everyone talked about, and I was the quiet kid who stayed out of the way. Teachers knew Ryan because my parents constantly praised his achievements to anyone who would listen. When people met me, they often said something like, "Oh, you're Ryan's brother." It felt like my entire identity had been reduced to being related to someone else. High school made everything even harder to ignore. Ryan had grown into exactly the kind of person our parents loved showing off. He was popular, confident, and good enough at sports to earn constant attention. My parents went to every game he played, cheering loudly from the stands while telling their friends how proud they were. When I joined clubs or worked on projects for school, their reactions were polite but distant, like they were acknowledging something minor before moving on to more important things. The moment that really defined the difference between us happened when Ryan turned 17. For weeks, my parents had been hinting about a big surprise they were planning for him. On the morning of his birthday, we all walked outside, and there was sitting in the driveway a shiny used car with a big red ribbon stretched across the hood. Ryan looked like he had just won the lottery. My parents hugged him and told him he deserved it because of how hard he worked and how responsible he had become. The entire day was filled with excitement as he drove around the neighborhood, showing it off. I stood there smiling because that was what I had learned to do, even though part of me felt strangely hollow watching it all happen. A year later, when I turned 17, there was no car waiting in the driveway. My parents handed me a set of keys, but they were attached to something much smaller. It was a used bike they had found at a garage sale, the paint slightly chipped and the tires looking like they had already lived a long life. My dad patted me on the shoulder and said that learning responsibility started with simple things. My mom added that a bike would help me appreciate the value of transportation before expecting something bigger. I nodded and thanked them because arguing never changed anything. By that point, I had already started to understand something important about my place in the Carter family. Ryan was the future they were proud to invest in, the one they believed would accomplish something impressive. I was simply the lesson they used to remind themselves about responsibility and modest expectations. Over time, I stopped looking for fairness because every experience had already taught me exactly how the story was going to play out. By the time Ryan and I reached adulthood, The distance between our lives had stretched so wide that it almost felt like we had grown up in entirely different families. Looking back at those years, the contrast became impossible to ignore, not just in the big moments, but in the quiet details that slowly shaped the direction of our futures. Ryan continued moving through life with the kind of support system that made every step easier, while I learned very quickly that if I wanted something, I would have to build it completely on my own. When Ryan finished high school, my parents proudly announced that he had been accepted into a private university in Chicago. The way they talked about it made it sound like a life-changing achievement, not just for him, but for the entire family. They organized a celebratory dinner, invited relatives, and spent most of the evening talking about how bright Ryan's future was going to be. I remember sitting quietly at the table while they discussed tuition plans, dorm options, and how they were going to make sure Ryan could focus entirely on his studies without worrying about anything else. And they meant it. My parents paid his full tuition without hesitation. They covered his rent when he moved out of the dorms after his first year, and whenever Ryan mentioned money problems, the situation seemed to magically resolve itself. Sometimes it was a transfer to his bank account. Sometimes it was my parents paying off a credit card bill he had run up after a weekend trip with friends. Every time it happened, they treated it like a completely reasonable thing to do for someone they believed in. My path after high school looked very different. I enrolled in a small state college not far from home, mostly because it was the only option I could realistically afford. There were no celebratory dinners when my acceptance letter arrived. My parents nodded politely, said it was good that I was being practical, and reminded me that working hard would build character. From the beginning, I understood that tuition, books, rent, and everything else were my responsibility. To make it work, I started working at a warehouse during the day, loading and unloading shipments for long hours that left my back aching by the time my shift ended. In the evenings, I attended classes, usually running on coffee and whatever cheap food I could grab between lectures. When the semester bills piled up faster than my savings could handle, I added another job delivering food late at night. There were nights when I drove around until 2 or 3 in the morning, dropping off takeout orders while the rest of the city slept, only to wake up a few hours later and start the entire cycle again. While my schedule was built around survival, Ryan's college experience looked like something out of a completely different world. Whenever he came home for holidays, he talked about parties, networking events, and trips he took with his friends. My parents listened with pride, asking about his classes and telling everyone how impressive his university was. When I mentioned how busy my schedule had become, the conversation usually shifted quickly back to Ryan. Years passed like that, each of us moving forward in the direction our circumstances allowed. When Ryan graduated from his university, my parents organized another celebration that felt even bigger than the one they held when he was accepted. Family members traveled in from different states to attend the ceremony. Afterward, we went out to a restaurant where my parents made a toast about how proud they were of the man Ryan had become and how this was only the beginning of his success. A few months later, they helped him buy a condo downtown, explaining that real estate was a smart investment and that it would give him a strong start in life. I watched all of this happen from a distance that had started to feel strangely normal. When my own graduation came around, the moment passed with far less attention. I finished my final exams, picked up my diploma, and drove home after the ceremony without much celebration. A few days later, my parents handed me a small envelope. Inside was a $50 gift card to a local restaurant and a short message written on the receipt saying they were proud that I had managed to finish college. The wording stuck with me longer than the amount itself because it sounded less like pride and more like mild surprise. Despite everything, I kept pushing forward. During those exhausting years, I had developed a quiet routine that almost no one in my family knew about. After work and classes were finished, I spent whatever free time I had teaching myself programming. It started with simple online tutorials and cheap textbooks I bought secondhand. But over time, I began building small tools that helped automate basic tasks. Because I'd spent so many hours around warehouses and delivery routes, I started experimenting with programs that could help trucking companies track shipments more efficiently or plan routes that save time and fuel. The projects were small at first, nothing impressive enough to talk about casually, but each one taught me something new. Night after night, I sat in front of an old laptop, writing code, testing ideas, and slowly improving the systems I'd built. Some local trucking companies eventually agreed to try the tools I created, mostly because they were inexpensive and surprisingly useful. Through all of it, my family never once asked what I was working on during those late nights. To them, I was still the quiet brother who worked too much and kept to himself, the one who had taken the practical path and simply tried to stay afloat. Over time, I stopped expecting them to notice anything beyond that. After I graduated and settled into a routine that revolved around work, bills, and very little sleep, the quiet project I'd started during college slowly turned into something much bigger than I had ever expected. At the time, it still felt small, almost insignificant, like a personal challenge that helped me make sense of the long hours I had already spent around warehouses, delivery routes, and logistics problems that most people never thought about. What started as a simple curiosity about how shipments moved across cities eventually became an obsession with finding ways to make those systems run more efficiently. For nearly a decade, I worked on that idea almost entirely alone. My apartment during those years was small and cramped, the kind of place where the living room and workspace blended together because there simply wasn't enough room for separation. My desk was an old wooden table I'd found at a thrift store, and the laptop I used had already been replaced by newer models several times over in most offices. But every night after finishing my regular job, I sat down in that chair and opened the same project files, slowly expanding the platform I had started building during college. The goal of the software was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. Shipping companies constantly struggled with inefficient routes, wasted fuel, and outdated tracking systems that forced managers to rely on guesswork more often than actual data. I started designing a platform that could analyze routes in real time, predict delays, and suggest adjustments that saved both time and fuel. At first, the system could only handle small data sets, but each improvement made it a little more powerful than before. Most nights I coded until 2 or 3 in the morning, surviving on cheap takeout containers stacked next to my keyboard and cups of coffee that kept getting colder as I focused on debugging lines of code. The glow from my laptop screen often became the only light in the room as the rest of the city went quiet outside my window. It was a strange existence that balanced exhaustion with a constant sense of progress, even if that progress felt invisible to everyone else. Family life continued moving in its familiar pattern during those same years. Whenever I visited my parents for dinner, the conversations almost always revolved around Ryan and whatever new phase of life he had entered. One month, it was a new gadget he had bought that everyone wanted to see. Another month, it was a vacation he had taken somewhere warm while the rest of us listened to stories about beaches and expensive restaurants. Sometimes he talked about his latest attempt at starting a business, an idea that sounded exciting but always seemed to depend heavily on money my parents were willing to provide. My parents listened to him with the same pride they had always shown, asking questions and encouraging every plan he described. When the conversation eventually shifted around the table, it rarely stayed on me for long. I usually mentioned that work had been busy or that I had been learning some new technical skills, which was enough to satisfy their curiosity before attention drifted back to Ryan. I never talked about the platform I was building because I already understood how that conversation would go. It would sound too complicated, too abstract, and far less interesting than Ryan's latest stories. Over time, I stopped even thinking about sharing it. The project existed in a completely separate part of my life, one that belonged only to the quiet hours after midnight when no one else was watching. Eventually, though, the software started gaining real traction. A small trucking company that had tested one of my early versions reported that their fuel costs had dropped noticeably after using the route optimization system. Another company heard about it through word of mouth and asked if I could adapt the platform for their fleet. Each new client forced me to improve the infrastructure, rewrite parts of the code, and expand the system so it could handle larger volumes of data. What had once been a simple tool slowly turned into a full platform capable of analyzing complex logistics networks. Over the next few years, several mid-sized logistics companies signed contracts to use the software. The agreements were modest compared to what large tech companies dealt with, but for me, they represented something much bigger than money. They proved that the thousands of quiet hours spent coding alone in that small apartment had created something that actually worked. The platform continued growing in ways I never could have predicted when I first started writing those early lines of code. More clients joined, the system became faster and more accurate, and the data it generated started attracting attention from people far outside the small logistics circles where it had originally spread. Then one afternoon, I received an email that changed everything. A large technology firm had been analyzing emerging logistics platforms and had taken interest in the system I had built. At first, I assumed the message was some kind of automated inquiry, but after several meetings and long conversations with their representatives, it became clear that they were serious. They believed the platform had the potential to scale far beyond the companies currently using it, and they wanted to acquire the entire system along with the technology behind it. The number they eventually placed on the table was $31 million. Sitting there in my small apartment, surrounded by the same cluttered desk and empty coffee cups that had witnessed nearly a decade of quiet work, the offer felt almost unreal compared to the long years when no one had even known the project existed. A few weeks after the acquisition deal was finalized, Christmas arrived, and like every year, my parents hosted dinner at their house. The routine had barely changed since we were kids. The same decorations hung in the living room. The same large table was set in the dining area, and the same familiar rhythm of conversation filled the house as relatives and a few family friends arrived throughout the afternoon. It was one of those evenings that felt predictable from beginning to end, the kind where everyone already knew what topics would dominate the discussion long before the first plate of food was served. Ryan was already there when I arrived, sitting comfortably in the living room while showing our parents something on his phone. From the sound of it, he had recently ordered another expensive piece of tech equipment, and my dad was leaning closer to the screen while Ryan explained why it was supposedly the best version on the market. My mom listened with interest, occasionally asking questions and laughing at Ryan's commentary the way she always had. I greeted everyone, hung my coat by the door, and took a seat near the end of the couch. The moment passed in the usual way. Ryan dominated the conversation, my parents reacted with enthusiasm, and I stayed mostly quiet while listening. Dinner eventually began, and everyone gathered around the table while plates were passed back and forth. The conversation followed the same pattern it always had during holidays. Ryan talked about recent trips he had taken, about a business idea he had been thinking about, and about some new gadget he planned to buy in the coming months. My parents responded with the same mixture of admiration and encouragement that had filled our family dinners for as long as I could remember. At some point, my mother glanced toward me and asked the standard question about how work had been going lately. It was the kind of casual check-in that usually led to a short answer before the focus returned to Ryan again. For years, I had simply said things were fine or that work kept me busy. That night, I answered a little differently. I mentioned as calmly as I could that things had actually changed recently because I had sold the company I had been building. The words landed at the table with an odd kind of silence that seemed to stretch longer than expected. For a moment, no one reacted at all, like they were waiting for a punchline that never arrived. Then Ryan laughed. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they assume a joke has just been told. He leaned back slightly in his chair and shook his head, smiling as if I had delivered an unexpected bit of humor in the middle of dinner. When I didn't laugh with him, the room grew quieter. I explained in the same calm tone that the platform I had been building for logistics companies had been acquired by a technology firm. I briefly described the deal, mentioning the acquisition and the amount involved. I spoke carefully and slowly, not because I wanted to dramatize it, but because the words themselves still felt strange even to me. The atmosphere at the table changed almost immediately. My mother looked confused at first, her expression shifting as she tried to process what I had said. My father stared at me with narrowed eyes, leaning slightly forward as if he was trying to decide whether he had misunderstood something important. Ryan stopped smiling entirely. My father was the first to respond, his voice firm and skeptical as he asked what exactly I meant by selling a company. The way he spoke made it sound less like curiosity and more like a challenge. I repeated the explanation, describing how the software had grown over the years and how the acquisition had been finalized recently. The silence returned again, heavier this time. Ryan's expression changed slowly, moving from disbelief to something far more tense. He stared at me across the table like he was trying to find the flaw in what I was saying. Instead of congratulating me or even acknowledging the possibility that it might be true, he slammed his glass down on the table hard enough that the sound echoed through the room. He said I was exaggerating. The words came out sharp and irritated, as if the entire situation had suddenly offended him. He insisted that I must be stretching the truth, that deals like that didn't just happen out of nowhere, especially not to someone who had never even talked about building a company before. I didn't argue. Instead, I quietly reached for my phone and opened the announcement that had been published after the acquisition was finalized. The article described the platform, the purchase, and the company that had bought it. Without saying anything else, I turned the screen and slid it across the table toward him. Ryan looked down at it. For a few seconds, the entire room stayed silent while he read the screen. Then something happened that none of us seemed prepared for. Ryan's face tightened, and the anger that had been building behind his expression suddenly broke through. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the phone back across the table. The disbelief that had been there moments earlier turned into something much more emotional. To everyone's shock, his eyes filled with tears. He stood up abruptly from his chair, his voice rising as he started shouting across the table. The words came out uneven and angry, mixed with frustration that seemed to spill out all at once. He accused me of taking something that he believed should have been his, insisting that the life I had just described was the one he had always been meant to have. The room sat frozen while his voice echoed through the house. The quiet Christmas dinner we had started only minutes earlier, now completely shattered by the realization that the invisible brother he had ignored for years had somehow stepped into a future he believed belonged to him. The moment Ryan's outburst faded into the heavy silence that followed, the entire mood in the house shifted from shock to something far more tense. The warmth that usually filled our parents' home during the holidays disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a strange mix of anger, disbelief, and something that felt disturbingly close to resentment. I had expected confusion or maybe awkward congratulations after revealing the sale of the company, but the reaction unfolding around the table felt like stepping into a completely different reality. Ryan was still standing near his chair, his face flushed and his breathing uneven. The tears that had appeared moments earlier had turned into a hard glare directed straight at me. My parents looked between the two of us, clearly unsettled. But instead of calming the situation, the conversation slowly began moving in a direction I had never imagined. Ryan started speaking again, this time with a cold determination that made every word sound deliberate. He said that if what I claimed was true, then the money I had received was not entirely mine to keep. At first, I assumed he was still reacting emotionally to the shock of the moment. But the way he explained his reasoning made it clear that he believed what he was saying completely. He argued that the family had spent years investing in his future because everyone had always expected him to succeed, and that those investments had come at the expense of opportunities that could have been shared differently. According to him, the resources my parents had poured into his education, his lifestyle, and his various business attempts were proof that the family had always been building toward success together. In his mind, my sudden financial outcome was somehow connected to those years of support directed at him. The logic made no sense to me, but Ryan delivered it with absolute certainty. Our mother slowly joined the conversation, her voice softer, but carrying the same underlying assumption. She said that families were supposed to share success, and that no one in the family should ever end up so far ahead of the others. The way she spoke made it sound less like a suggestion and more like an unwritten rule that I had somehow violated simply by keeping what I had earned. My father's reaction came next, and it was harsher than anything I had expected. He leaned forward across the table with an expression I had rarely seen directed at me before. Instead of acknowledging the years of work that had gone into building the platform, he accused me of becoming selfish the moment money entered the picture. He said that success meant nothing if it separated someone from their family, and that refusing to share it showed a deep lack of gratitude for the people who had raised me. I listened quietly while they spoke, trying to process how the conversation had moved from disbelief to accusation so quickly. When they finished, I told them calmly that the company had been built entirely through my own work over nearly 10 years, and that the deal had nothing to do with any financial support from the family. The words did nothing to ease the tension. If anything, they seemed to make the situation worse. Ryan shook his head as if I had completely missed the point. He repeated that the family had spent more resources on him over the years because everyone believed he would eventually succeed in a major way. According to his reasoning, my unexpected success had disrupted the balance that had been building for decades. The conversation dragged on for hours that night, moving in circles that never reached any real resolution. Every explanation I offered was met with a new argument about fairness, family responsibility, or what they believed they deserved after everything they had done for me growing up. By the time I finally left the house, the air between us felt colder than it ever had before. What surprised me most was what happened in the days that followed. At first, I thought the entire confrontation had simply been an emotional overreaction fueled by the shock of the announcement. I assumed everyone would calm down after a few days and realize how unreasonable the conversation had become. Instead, things escalated. About a week later, Ryan sent me a long message late at night. The tone was completely different from the anger he had shown at Christmas dinner. This time, the message read like a carefully written argument, filled with explanations about fairness, lost opportunities, and what he described as the imbalance that had developed between our lives. At the end of the message, he stated the amount he believed would correct that imbalance. $8 million. He described it as fair compensation for what he called the opportunities he had lost because the family had focused on his potential rather than dividing their resources equally between us. According to him, that financial support had been a form of investment in the family's future success, and now that success had arrived through me instead of him. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to understand how someone could genuinely believe something like that. Ryan continued sending messages over the following days, each one longer than the last. Some of them sounded calm and calculated, while others slipped back into anger and frustration. In every version of the argument, the number stayed the same: $8 million. My mother began calling almost daily. Her approach was different from Ryan's, but carried the same conclusion. She spoke about family unity, about how money should never divide relatives, and about how sharing the success would restore harmony after the conflict that had erupted during Christmas dinner. The conversations always ended with the same suggestion: sending Ryan a portion of the money would prove that I still cared about the family. My father occasionally joined those calls, repeating the same accusations about selfishness and ingratitude whenever the discussion turned toward my refusal. After several days of listening to the same arguments repeated in different forms, something became painfully clear. They were not speaking emotionally or exaggerating in the heat of the moment. They genuinely believed they were entitled to the success I had built alone. A few days after the endless calls and messages about money had started to feel like a constant background noise in my life, something happened that made the entire situation take a far darker turn. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk going through emails related to the transition work after the acquisition when my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. At first, I assumed it was one of the routine alerts I had grown used to since the deal closed, the kind that simply informed me about account activity or security updates. Instead, the message was labeled as a security warning about suspicious login attempts. The notification explained that multiple attempts had been made to access my primary account using devices that were not recognized by the system. Because the financial activity connected to my accounts had increased dramatically after the acquisition, the bank had automatically enabled additional monitoring protocols, which meant even small irregularities triggered alerts. According to the message, several login attempts had occurred within a short period of time, all failing because the authentication process had not been completed correctly. At first, I thought it might have been some random hacking attempt from somewhere overseas, the kind of automated intrusion banks deal with constantly. But when I opened the security dashboard and reviewed the details, the information made me pause. The login attempts were not coming from another country or even another state. They were coming from devices located less than 15 miles away. The system listed approximate locations for each attempt, and every one of them pointed to the same neighborhood where my parents lived. I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to convince myself that the location data had to be some kind of coincidence or technical error. The idea that anyone in that house would try to access my financial accounts felt too extreme to even consider seriously. Then I saw the rest of the report. 2 transfer requests had been flagged by the bank's fraud detection system. Neither request had gone through because the verification process had failed, but both attempts had been recorded in detail. Each request had been attempting to move a large amount of money out of one of my investment accounts. Both transfer destinations were the same. An account registered under Ryan's name. The moment I read that information, the room felt suddenly colder. I leaned back in my chair and tried to process what I was looking at, hoping there was some misunderstanding in the data or some bizarre clerical error. But the transaction logs were precise, showing the timestamps, device fingerprints, and the exact routing information connected to the transfer attempts. Whoever had tried to access my accounts had not just been testing passwords or guessing randomly. They had gone far enough into the system to initiate large transfers. The bank's fraud protection had stopped the transactions before they could be completed, but the fact that the attempts had been made at all meant someone had believed they had a real chance of moving that money. I immediately contacted the bank security department and explained that the login attempts and transfer requests were not authorized by me. Within minutes, they locked down several layers of access on my accounts, temporarily freezing certain functions while they reviewed the activity logs. They assured me that no funds had been moved and that the protective systems had worked exactly as designed. Even with that reassurance, the situation felt deeply unsettling. The location data still pointed toward the same place: my parents' house. After the call with the bank ended, I sat quietly for a while, staring at the security report displayed on my laptop screen. The digital trail was extremely clear. The login attempts had come from devices connected to the same residential network. The bank system even listed identifiers showing that the devices were operating through that network at the exact times the access attempt had occurred. I realized then that this was no longer just a family argument about money. Someone had actually tried to take it. That realization forced me to make a decision I had never imagined needing to make about my own family. I began searching for legal professionals who specialized in financial fraud and digital asset protection. After several consultations, I contacted a lawyer named Clara Bennett, who had built a reputation handling cases involving unauthorized financial access and complex digital trails. When we met, I brought every piece of documentation the bank had provided. Clara reviewed the reports carefully, her expression growing more serious as she moved through each page. She examined the login logs, the flag transfer attempts, and the device identification data attached to the activity. The level of detail in the records made it extremely difficult to dismiss what had happened as an accident. What shocked both of us the most was how clear the digital trail actually was. Every login attempt had been recorded with technical identifiers that traced back to devices operating on the same home network. The system logs showed the approximate geographic location, the timestamps, and even the unique signatures of the devices used during the attempts. All of it pointed back to the same place. Inside my parents' home network. Sitting there in Clara's office while she explained how strong that digital evidence was, I felt a heavy realization settle over me. The situation had crossed a line that could not simply be ignored or explained away as a misunderstanding. Someone in that house had tried to access my accounts and move money into Ryan's name, and the evidence was already recorded in systems designed specifically to track that kind of activity. After leaving Clara Bennett's office with copies of the security reports and a clear explanation of how strong the digital evidence actually was, I understood that the situation had already moved far beyond a simple family argument. The instinct to call my parents immediately and demand an explanation crossed my mind more than once during the drive home. But every time the thought surfaced, I remembered Clara's advice during our meeting. She had spoken calmly and carefully, explaining that when financial misconduct was involved, emotional confrontations often destroyed the clarity of evidence that could later become critical. Instead of reacting impulsively, she recommended something much colder and more methodical. Document everything. Over the next several days, I began organizing every message, call log, and financial record connected to the conflict that had started during Christmas dinner. I saved the text messages Ryan had sent demanding $8 million and explaining why he believed he deserved it. I preserved the voicemail recordings from my mother, where she repeatedly urged me to transfer money in order to restore family balance. I compiled the bank alerts showing the unauthorized login attempts and the flag transfer requests that had tried to move large sums into Ryan's account. Clara and her team reviewed every piece of that information and began assembling a case that was far more serious than I had initially imagined. The legal process moved forward quietly but steadily. Within a short time, Clara filed documents requesting formal legal protection over my financial assets while simultaneously beginning a civil case involving attempted financial theft and fraud. The moment the legal notices were delivered, the dynamic between my family and me changed completely. Ryan stopped sending casual messages and started responding through a lawyer of his own. My parents suddenly shifted from emotional phone calls to carefully worded statements that sounded far more cautious than anything they had said before. The entire conflict that had once played out through angry texts and late-night arguments was now being pulled into a structured legal process where every claim had to be supported by evidence. That was where the truth began to unravel. During the early stages of the case, Clara requested detailed records from the bank and the network providers connected to the devices used during the login attempts. The digital logs that had originally alerted the bank turned out to be only the beginning. Financial institutions maintain extremely precise records of system access, including timestamps, device fingerprints, network identifiers, and authentication attempts. When those records were combined with data from the home internet provider linked to my parents' address, the pattern became unmistakably clear. Multiple login attempts had been made from devices operating on the same home network. Those attempts had progressed far enough through the system to initiate transfer requests, and the destination account attached to those transfers belonged to Ryan. The case moved into depositions, where each person involved had to provide sworn testimony about what had happened. Sitting in those quiet conference rooms while attorneys asked precise questions about events that had once felt like private family matters was one of the strangest experiences of my life. The atmosphere was completely different from the chaotic arguments that had taken place during Christmas dinner. Every statement was recorded, every answer carried legal weight, and every inconsistency could be examined against the growing pile of digital evidence. Ryan attempted to defend his actions by repeating the same argument he had made earlier. He claimed that the money represented an imbalance created by years of family investment in his future. According to his explanation, the attempts to access my accounts had been part of what he believed was an effort to correct that imbalance. Hearing him present that reasoning in a legal setting, under oath, made the entire situation feel even more surreal. My parents tried a different approach. They insisted that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding caused by confusion about financial access and account details. Their statement suggested that no one had intended to commit fraud and that the login attempts must have been accidental or misinterpreted by the bank's security systems. The problem with that explanation was the evidence. The bank logs clearly showed repeated login attempts from the same devices. The authentication failures indicated multiple password attempts. The system records documented the exact sequence of actions taken within the account interface, including the initiation of transfer requests and the routing information connected to Ryan's account. There was no technical ambiguity left for interpretation. As the depositions continued, the attorneys on both sides began recognizing the same reality. The evidence trail was far too detailed to dismiss as a simple mistake. The digital records, combined with the earlier text messages demanding money, created a narrative that was extremely difficult to challenge. Eventually, the pressure of that evidence forced the situation toward a resolution. Rather than allowing the case to proceed deeper into a full trial with potentially severe consequences, the opposing legal team began negotiating a settlement. The discussions took place through lawyers rather than direct communication, but the outcome became clear over several weeks of careful negotiation. The agreement that was eventually reached included several strict conditions. Ryan and my parents were required to provide financial restitution connected to the legal costs and damages created by the attempted transfers. They were also required to sign written admissions acknowledging that the unauthorized access attempts had occurred and that those actions had violated financial security laws. Perhaps the most significant part of the settlement involved legally binding restrictions that prohibited them from contacting me in the future regarding money, financial assets, or any claims of entitlement connected to the company I had built. When the final documents were signed, the conflict that had started as a family argument at a holiday dinner had officially transformed into a closed legal case. The entire process left behind something that felt far more permanent than the original dispute. What had once been emotional accusations and demands had been replaced by legal records, documented evidence, and binding agreements that would remain on file long after the arguments themselves faded. When the legal process finally ended and the settlement documents were signed, I expected to feel relief more than anything else. For years, I had imagined that if the tension inside my family ever reached a breaking point, the resolution would bring some kind of emotional clarity or peace. Instead, what settled over me was something quieter and far more complicated. The illusion I had carried since childhood, the idea that no matter how uneven things had always felt, there was still a basic loyalty holding the family together, had completely collapsed. The case had forced everything into the open in a way that could never be undone. What had started as arguments about fairness and resentment had turned into documented evidence of deliberate actions, recorded in legal filings and financial reports that existed far beyond private family conversations. Once those records existed, the story stopped being something that could be ignored or quietly forgotten. The consequences spread outward faster than I expected. Ryan's life changed almost immediately after the case closed. Not long afterward, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had sold the luxury car he used to drive around the city. The car had always been one of his favorite symbols of success, something he proudly showed off whenever he visited our parents' neighborhood. Seeing it disappear from his life felt like a quiet signal that the version of confidence he had built around himself had started to crack. My parents reacted differently. For years, they had been active in social circles around their community, attending events, neighborhood gatherings, and small local fundraisers where they enjoyed presenting themselves as a close and successful family. Once the details of the dispute became known to some of those circles, their appearances at those gatherings grew noticeably less frequent. Conversations about the situation traveled faster than anyone could control, and eventually it became easier for them to avoid the subject entirely by avoiding the places where people might bring it up. I watched all of this unfold from a growing distance. The settlement agreement meant there was no longer direct communication between us about money or anything related to the case. Without those constant arguments and phone calls filling my days, I suddenly found myself with something unfamiliar. Space. For the first time in years, I was able to step back and think about what I actually wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. The company I had built was no longer mine to run, and the financial outcome of the acquisition had removed the constant pressure that had defined most of my adult life. The quiet apartment where I'd spent nearly a decade writing code until 3 in the morning suddenly felt like a place tied too strongly to an earlier version of myself. After several months of reflection, I made a decision that felt both simple and significant. I moved to Denver. The city offered something I had not experienced in a long time, a sense of starting over without the constant shadow of old family dynamics hanging over every decision. The change of environment helped me look at my life from a different perspective. Instead of focusing only on what had gone wrong with my family, I began thinking about how the experiences that shaped me could be used for something more constructive. During the years I spent working multiple jobs while teaching myself programming, one truth had become painfully clear. Talent and ambition often existed in people who had absolutely no support system behind them. I had met countless individuals who were capable of building incredible things, but lacked the resources, guidance, or encouragement that could turn their ideas into reality. That realization led me to invest part of the money from the acquisition into mentoring programs for young entrepreneurs from low-income backgrounds. These programs focused on people who reminded me strongly of the person I had once been. They were individuals who worked long hours at ordinary jobs while quietly building projects at night. People who carried ambition but rarely received recognition or encouragement from the environments they grew up in. Working with them changed something inside me. Instead of spending my time thinking about the years of imbalance between my brother and me, I started focusing on helping people who were still in the stage of life where a small amount of guidance could make an enormous difference. I met young developers writing their first lines of code on outdated laptops. I met students trying to launch small business ideas while juggling work schedules that left them exhausted. I met people who had never heard anyone tell them that their ideas might actually be worth pursuing. Every time I listened to their stories, I recognized pieces of my own past. The more time I spent working with them, the more clearly I understood something that had taken decades to fully sink in. For most of my life, I had believed that family was something defined entirely by blood, something that automatically created loyalty and support simply because people shared the same last name. What the past few years had revealed was a very different reality. Respect, encouragement, and genuine pride in someone else's success did not come from genetics or shared history. Those things came from people who valued what you built rather than feeling threatened by it for the first time in my life. Surrounded by people who celebrated progress instead of resenting it, I began to understand a much simpler and more powerful truth about what family actually meant. Real family was not determined by who happened to be related to you. Real family was made up of the people who respected the work you put into your life and stood beside you when that work finally paid off instead of trying to take it away.